Good evening. My talk has a title tonight. It's called Food for the Journey. Food for the Journey. And I'm going to start by reading you a fairly long story. And I apologize for its length. But I thought, well, I could tell you the story, but it wouldn't have the same flavor, I think, as if I read it. This is a particularly lovely rendering of a story that you will know parts of, but maybe haven't heard the whole thing altogether. And then I thought, well, I could read part of the story or something like that to shorten it up, and that didn't quite work either. So I'd like to start with a little story time. So, a long story. And the title of the story is Touching the Earth. I believe it was written by Ajahn Suchito. Centuries ago, a seeker, one who searches for a way beyond birth and death, that is suffering, was wandering through a remote valley of one of the many tributaries of the Ganges River. He had been wandering for 6 years, and in the course of that time had studied under teachers, developed meditation, and strengthened his considerable resolve. Most recently, he had been part of a group of 6 ascetics, whose view was that the way to liberation opened through disregarding or suppressing the senses. Eating solid food was to be done begrudgingly, if at all. The body was to be chastised and its needs given no attention. In this, as in all his previous spiritual disciplines, the seeker excelled his companions. And yet, he knew that he had attained no superior state and gained no liberating wisdom. At this critical point, reduced to a scrawny creature of little more than flaking skin and bone, he had left the group to intensify his practice in solitude. Finally, he found a grove of trees and took up the sitting position at the root of a fig tree, determined to sit in full awareness, mind bent on investigating whatever might arise in his consciousness. His aim was to see if there could be a way through the shifting manifestations of thoughts and sensations and emotions, to discover whether there was some absolute and untrammeled state. Yet as he tried to apply himself, he found that his body was now too weak to even sustain sitting upright, nor was his mind steady and clear. Strained and driven only by willpower, it could neither open nor settle into calm. Instead, his mind formed voices that whispered in his inner ear, some accusing, some mocking. Strange visions flittered through the shifting veils of consciousness. He was unable to repel or investigate them. A despondent inertia hovered over him like a vulture. There were some slight sounds and a quiet voice that at first barely made an impression on his mind. Groggy as he was, his awareness still sensed a shift in the gloom of his near-death state. Pulling apart the eyelids which had glued shut, he made out the form of a young woman kneeling in front of him with a dish. "Sujata asks for your blessing, noble one," she said gently, as she laid the dish in front of him. "Please partake of my offering, so that my generosity can be fulfilled." He moved his lips, but his throat could not form words. Yet her kindness touched chords in his heart, and a sense that had been ignored for years stirred. Before he could form a thought, his head had made a movement of assent, and one skinny hand had lifted in response. Sujata smiled and withdrew, and while allowing the natural instinct to move through him, the seeker found himself carefully scooping a meal of sweet milk rice from the dish, one slow mouthful at a time, until he had consumed it all. Life flowed through his system like the sap that fed the tree under which he sat. Why not, he thought, let nature look after nature? What good is there in fighting against its laws? Why not let it support me in this quest? With his body refreshed and his mind clearing from its near-death delirium, he sat cross-legged and upright under the canopy of the tree and steadied his awareness on the experience of breathing in and out. It suddenly occurred to him that when he was a child he had done just that, quite spontaneously, and it had taken him to a place of natural calm. Eagerly, he picked up the theme. Evening came, and with it shadows and the sounds of the many animals that move through the night. Sensing this, the seeker's mind entered its own deep shadows and all that lurks there. Fear and uncertainty arose, followed by a procession of moods, apathy, craving, and negativity, amongst many others, swelled into a veritable army attacking his resolve. Boredom, sense desire, drowsiness, and passions beset him as he sat there hour after hour. And yet, now on guard against every inner voice as well as against forcefully suppressing them, he continued to sit firm and upright in full awareness. The night progressed while the power of these energies seemed to crystallize into one great raging force. It was like a demon battering and tugging him, and it swept into the depths of his heart, where he could hear its seductive whispering. Why sit here under a tree at night alone, wasting your youth? How can anything good come of this painful and impotent sojourn? Why not trust life? Learn as you go through its joys and marvels and challenges. It's late. Take a rest and see what the morning brings. The seeker unified his mind around his resolve and looked for a clear response. Eventually, one came. I know you. You're Mara, the deceiver, the voice of death. You're the one who has kept me chasing delusions and running from shadows through life after life and death after death. This time I'm not budging. You won't shift me with your doubts and your false promises. You know nothing, and you'll get nothing out of sitting here. Death will sweep you away like a twig in a flood, said Mara. And even before that comes, I can call in forces of fear, loneliness, and longing that will drive you to despair and send you running for comfort. You just have one feeble body and a heart awash with confusion. How do you think that your sitting still is going to conquer me? My body is mortal, but I'm not relying on that. My heart may sense fear and craving, but I'm not taking a stand on that. I have an inheritance of many lives spent in working for purity, both of conduct and of mind. And sitting still, alone, unarmed, I also can command a tide that will check your flood. I stand on being at peace with whatever arises. Here, now, I call this very earth to witness that I am ready, ripe with all the perfections that are needed to sweep you and your demon host out of my heart. With these words, the seeker focused his attention deep within his embodied awareness. In that calm center beneath personality, thoughts and moods, he touched into a rich ground. Our response was not long in coming. His firmness grew as he recollected the huge store of virtues and resolves that he had enacted over many lives. And in his mind's eye, the very spirit of the earth rose up like a goddess. Wrapping her long hair into a braid, she twisted it and wrung out of it a great fountain of water that swept through the darkness of the grove. His heart brimmed with confidence, and clarity radiated around him. Mara and his entire host had dissolved like mist at dawn. After allowing the clarity and joy to wash their refreshing tides through him, the seeker resumed his introspection. He began recalling the results of acts based on kindness, patience, resolve, and more, the deeds of many lifetimes. He reviewed the processes that determine everyone's life, the pressure, turmoil, and pain that accompanied them, and finally how they can be put to rest. By the time that dawn had arisen, a deep, unshakable peace had settled within him. He had discovered the release from the grip of death. In years to come, many people who heard his teachings came to acknowledge the profundity of his realization. Sensing his deep clarity and mastery of mind, they called him Buddha, the full knowing, the enlightened, the awake. I'm going to pause for just a moment here. Ear. So, the Buddha's struggle, he had wholesome intention. He practiced and developed his skill. He was honest, looking clearly. He didn't go by rules or ideas. And actually, his friends initially abandoned him, thinking he had really lost it because he had eaten. But he was looking clearly at his practice. In fact, does this work? He allowed himself to receive goodness, even though it was against the rules of his training. And he then watched to see what would happen next. He saw that the earth, nature, could nourish and support him. And then he got tired and scared and confused all over again. He looked for a clear response, not just any response, a clear response, and waited for it. And when he found it, he was willing to act on it. Nevertheless, liberation did not come immediately. Mara continued. He held his ground. I'm looking for peace and freedom. I won't settle for anything less. He remembered his own goodness. He contemplated his own virtues, his intention, his own previous insights and accomplishment. And it opened into a deeper realization of what true freedom was. I read that story because a couple of things. In one of the suttas, the Buddha describes the fruit of his practice as a heart unshaken when in contact with the world. It's what he offers us, a heart unshaken when in contact with the world. Oh, it's why we do this. Ajahn Chah says, practice on the cushion for moments off the cushion when passions impact the heart. I used to have a fairly romantic view of this story and of the Buddha's life. And we often see these pictures and we see him surrounded by these little beings and angelic little creatures, and we see him sitting serenely, with the lotus and the, and all of that. And we think, well, once he was awakened, things got, pretty spacious and pretty easy. they did get pretty spacious, but they still weren't easy. He had plenty of hardships, even after enlightenment. His cousin Devadatta, for one, had been jealous of him ever since they were children in the palace. The Buddha's talents and attractiveness and skills, Devadatta was always coming in a little short behind him, and he'd always been jealous of him. And he became a follower of the Buddha's, but he remained, and he became even more intensely jealous, so much so that he engaged, he tried to kind of, sort of like, the Jeb Bush or something like that, or the Donald Trump of his day, that he really worked hard to kind of form political alliances that would undo the Buddha. And he openly confronted him and criticized him when the Buddha was teaching. And at least twice he tried to kill him. Once succeeding in seriously injuring him, causing him a great deal of pain. So the Buddha is dealing with all of this. Once the Buddha had to move his whole monastic community out of a town because there was so much kind of wrangling among it was so threatening, if you will, to the political powers in the town, that the Buddha said, okay, we'll just leave. And he moved his whole community. He had to leave, kind of pack everybody up and leave. One time the Buddha actually left his monks. He left the monastic community because they were arguing with one another. There was this faction and this faction. There were the Democrats and the Republicans. They were arguing with one another about the vinaya, the rules of the monastic community. Do it this way, no, do it that way. And the Buddha said, well, listen to me. I made the rules. I can kind of help you with it. And they wouldn't. They were latched onto these fixed views, and they wouldn't stop arguing, and they wouldn't listen to him. And so he said, okay, I'll be out in the forest if you need me. And he left them for a number of years before they finally called him back. So it wasn't like his life was a piece of cake after that. But the difference was he had pain, but he didn't have suffering. That it was difficult, it was challenging, but he didn't suffer with it. And it can even be kind of hard for us to even imagine what that might be like, because so often for us, the pain and the suffering just are so interwoven. So it wasn't like life after either his practice or life after enlightenment was so easy. It was that he discovered a way of navigating it such that he didn't suffer, and was able to then maintain that clarity of mind. The confused state of mind when we suffer? If you ever bumped into that, that we, and then somebody says, okay, I really need your help with this, and it's really hard to be clear, because our own minds are in such a turmoil. So that he was able to guide people with a clear state of mind, because the turmoil didn't invade his body and mind anymore. He was able to sustain it. And so I wanted to talk about food for the journey, because you're probably already contemplating this a little bit. We're going home tomorrow. We're going back to the news. We're going back to the newspapers, the evening news. We're going back to the weather reports. We're going back to political wranglings, floods and fires, streams of refugees. Racism, violence, climate change, homophobia, rancor, jealousy, loss and ill will in our families, in our work circumstances, the private sufferings of bodies that don't work so well, and dear ones for whom we care deeply who continue to struggle. We've been here, working with it all in our minds, but tomorrow we'll be back in the thick of it. So we can approach the world, our practice, our work situation, our families, ourselves even, with the best of intentions and with years of practice, and find ourselves unraveling as we, when we touch these sorts of circumstances. Ajahn Chah, I've spoken of him, he's like the grandfather of our practice here in the West. He lived for years in the as a hermit in the mountains of Thailand, and he attained these, what are said to be really pretty advanced states of concentration and transcendence. But he came down and formed a monastery, because when he did come back into the world, if you will, what he realized is that he would get pissed off, that he would get annoyed, that he would get troubled, that being there away from people protected him from having to deal with certain aspects of life and human relationships. And he wanted to be able to include that in his practice as well. So he formed monastic communities where he was the abbot of these monastic communities, so that he had an opportunity to deal with his own internal struggles in that way, when he could have just stayed up in the mountain and, been serene. Mike Tyson, the boxer Mike Tyson, says everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face, And that was what Ajahn Chah was working with, and what we'll be working with tomorrow, Whatever it is that comes up. I hear it's going to rain still, maybe even a lot tomorrow. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but whatever comes up, we'll go back to those families of ours and all the stuff, the jobs, and just all this stuff. Dukkha. Our challenge, like Father Greg Boyle I talked about last night, will be to do what we can, but ultimately not fixing or changing the entire world, but being with it, including ourselves, and acting with wisdom and with a heart of goodwill. Not a small order, is it? Here we are just sitting with the ideas about it on retreat, and we kind of get, wow, this is challenging, and then when we're really in the thick of it, how do we act with wisdom and with a heart of goodwill, and seeing from there what's needed, and indeed what's mine to do. Not only what's needed, not only how many whales need to be saved, but what's mine to do. And furthermore, what's mine to do here, now, this moment. What's mine to do? Mary Oliver, in a poem that I know many of you will know, has a line that I really sort of embedded in the middle of this poem. It sort of sneaks up on you. She says, "Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine." We all despair at times, don't we? How hard it is. Just how hard it is. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, she says, the world goes on. This is Clarissa Pinkola Estes, the woman who writes so beautifully. She says, the luster and hubris some have aspired to while endorsing acts so heinous against children, elders, everyday people, the poor, the unguarded, the helpless, is breathtaking. Yet I urge you, ask you, gentle you, to please not spend your spirit dry by bewailing these difficult times. I love that. Do not spend your spirit dry. Especially, do not lose hope. Most particularly because the fact is, we were made for these times. Yes, for years we have been learning, practicing, been in training for, and just waiting to meet on this exact plane of engagement. So our practice is, well, practice with this. Whatever the this is in any given moment, cultivating this in small ways, this wisdom, this clarity, this kindness, in small ways, day by day, moment by moment. This is Aung San Suu Kyi, who knows a good bit about that. She says it is from hardship rather than ease that we gather wisdom. We need to develop the capacity to draw strength from our hardships, to ignite the thunder flame of our own heart and let it illuminate the stormy night. Thich Nhat Hanh talked about years ago when the Vietnamese boat people were fleeing Vietnam after the collapse of the South, and pirates would attack their ships and kill them and take everything. And he said that if there was one person on the boat who stayed calm and clear, it made all the difference in the world in whether or not that group of people survived. And that there were stories after stories after stories of, a circumstance where one person was able to kind of help maintain calm and stability in the midst of panic. So how are we to not give up or to retreat to our own little, hermitages on the hill, to isolated efforts to protect ourselves? We can kind of feel it in our bones as we speak, as I speak, can't we? When we think about going back home, and we think, how do I gird my loins or something like that, as I go back to this. I want to read to you something. This is from, it's attributed to a Hopi elder. I don't really know who wrote it, but I like it, and it seems relevant, so I'm going to read it to you. So let's imagine that it's from a Native American elder. You have been telling the people that this is the 11th hour. Now you must go back and tell the people that this is the hour. And there are things to be considered. Where are you living? What are you doing? What are your relationships? Are you in right relation? Where is your water? Know your garden. It is time to speak your truth. Create your community. Be good to each other. And do not look outside yourself for the leader. Then he clasped his hands together, smiled, and said, "This could be a good time. There is a river flowing now very fast. It is so great and swift that there are those who will be afraid. They will try to hold on to the shore. They will feel they are torn apart and will suffer greatly. Know the river has its destination. The elders say we must let go of the shore, push off into the middle of the river, keep our eyes open and our heads above water. And I say, see who is there in there with you and celebrate. At this time in history, we are to take nothing personally. least of all ourselves. For the moment that we do, our spiritual growth and journey comes to a halt. The time for the lone wolf is over. Gather yourselves. Banish the word struggle from your attitude and your vocabulary. All that we do now must be done in a sacred manner and in celebration. This is my favorite line of the whole thing. We are the ones we have been waiting for. We are the ones we have been waiting for. We are the ones we have been waiting for. This is from Thich Nhat Hanh. He says, it is possible that the next Buddha will not take the form of an individual. The next Buddha may take the form of a community practicing understanding and loving kindness, a community practicing mindful living. This may be the most important thing we can do for the survival of the earth. We are the ones we have been waiting for. So how do we gather ourselves? I wanted to talk a little bit about, food for the journey. We've been doing our practice. What's the bowl of rice? What's the bowl of rice milk? What are the bowls, plural? Many, many, many of them. I'll just touch on a couple of them tonight. But food for the journey, what's the nourishment? That without that nourishment, our minds can't be clear. We're working, we're just struggling too hard against the river. We're struggling too hard to hold on. The first one I want to name is just opening to receive. A willingness to open, to receive goodness. And the Buddha's willingness to receive. He really had to challenge his own fixed views. Some of you in your interviews have noted the generosity there is in being willing to receive, to take something in. Often in mysterious ways, if we really pay attention. A week ago, last Friday morning, before I came here, I think it was Friday morning, before I came here, I was reading the Washington Post, and there's a story that had been archived from last January that they, for some reason, I don't know why, they put it back in the Post last Friday morning. And I want to read to you a part of it. He emerged from the metro at the L'Enfant Plaza station and positioned himself against a wall beside a trash basket. By most measures, he was nondescript. A tall, handsome, youngish white man in jeans, a long-sleeved T-shirt, and a Washington Nationals baseball cap. From a small case, he removed a violin. Placing the open case at his feet, he swiveled it to face pedestrian traffic and began to play. It was 7:51 a.m. on Friday, January 12th, the middle of the morning rush hour. In the next 43 minutes, as the violinist performed 6 classical pieces, 1,097 people passed by. Almost all of them were on their way to work. Each passerby had a quick choice to make, one familiar to commuters in any urban area where the occasional street performer is part of the cityscape. Do you stop and listen? Do you hurry past with a blend of guilt and irritation, aware of your cupidity but annoyed by the unbidden demand on your time and your wallet? Do you throw in a buck just to be polite? Does your decision change if he's really bad? What if he's really good? Do you have time for beauty? Shouldn't you? What's the moral mathematics of the moment? On that Friday in January, those private questions would be answered in an unusually public way. No one knew it, but the fiddler standing against a bare wall outside the metro in an indoor arcade at the top of the escalators was one of the finest classical musicians in the world, Joshua Bell, playing some of the most elegant music ever written on one of the most valuable violins ever made, $3.5 million worth to be exact. His performance was arranged by the Washington Post as an experiment in context, perception, and priorities. The musician, in a banal setting at an inconvenient time, would beauty transcend? The musician did not play popular tunes whose familiarity alone might have drawn interest. That was not the test. These were masterpieces that have endured for centuries on their brilliance alone, soaring music befitting the grandeur of cathedrals and concert halls. And they said that the metro station was very kind to the music. The acoustics were very kind. In the 3/4 of an hour that Joshua Bell played, 7 people stopped what they were doing to hang around and take in the performance at least for 1 minute. 27 gave money, most of them on the run, for a total of $32.17. That leaves the 1,070 people who hurried by, oblivious, many only 3 feet away, few even turning to look. But every single child pulled on his or her parent to stop and listen. And every single parent hurried their child away. Where is the everyday, ordinary, magic, mystery, nourishment that we hurry past and ignore and don't take in because we're too busy or preoccupied in our own minds and in our own worlds? Where's the food for the journey that we miss over and over again? That with our child's mind and our child's awareness, we would know it immediately. Are we willing to receive the countless blessings of ordinary kindness and goodness that support us as we travel? To really receive them. Kabir says, when the eyes and the ears are open, even the leaves on the trees teach like pages from the scriptures. When the eyes and the ears are open. So that's one. Another one, acknowledging and delighting in our own goodness, our own virtues. If you remember in the story, it was one of the supports that the Buddha used. You know, as Mara is tempting him, he said, wait a minute, I remember my goodness. I remember the goodness that I've done. And in my very favorite sutta of all time, he very explicitly invites us to contemplate our virtues. This is what he says. He says, furthermore, there is the case where you recollect your own virtues. They are untorn, unbroken, unspotted, unsplattered, liberating, praised by the wise, untarnished, conducive to concentration. At any time when a disciple of the noble ones is recollecting virtue, his mind is not overcome with passion, not overcome with aversion, not overcome with delusion. His mind heads straight, based on virtue. And when the mind is headed straight, the disciple of the noble one gains a sense of the goal, gains a sense of the Dhamma, gains joy connected with the Dhamma. In one who is joyful, rapture arises. In one who is rapturous, the body grows calm. One whose body is calmed experiences ease. In one at ease, the mind becomes concentrated. Mahanama, who was a householder, who had asked the Buddha, what should we think about? You guys have all these practices, but we're just householders. What should we think about? So this is his response to Mahanama. He said, you should develop this recollection of virtue while you are walking, while you are standing, while you are sitting, while you are lying down, while you are busy at work, while you are resting in your home, crowded with children. Recollecting our virtue. He invites us to recollect our generosity. He actually has, the sutta actually goes on to say the same thing specifically about generosity. He kind of pulls generosity out for special mention. Recollecting all of these things that nourish us and that help us have this kind of clarity of mind. In insight dialogue practice, we often ask people to contemplate their virtues, and we do it in groups of 3 or 4. And part of the contemplation is the person will speak to 2 or 3 other people, naming their own virtues. And it can be actually quite challenging. But it can be really interesting because the second part of the contemplation is asking the people who have heard those virtues to speak to what it touches in their own hearts and minds. And it can be just really pretty amazing to realize how inspiring it can be to other people for us to be able to sustain this recollection of our own virtue. Really, really lovely practice. My friend Gary Steinberg developed that one. And sort of along those lines, the third thing I want to note is allowing ourselves to be inspired by others. Really allowing ourselves to look at other people and just take heart from their goodness and their accomplishments. We dwell in community. There are wise and loving and wholesome people doing awesome acts of kindness and courage every day, every moment. One of my secret, I don't know if it's a vice or not, I don't know, but one of my secret vices that my husband laughs at is I'm a Reader's Digest junkie. You know how you used to go, it doesn't happen so much anymore, I used to go to the cottage in the summertime and there'd be those big stacks. I would take them all to my room and I would devour them, through the week. Because what I love about them is they have these stories about, I climbed Mount Everest and there were wolves and bears and I did it and this is how I did it and I had my friends and, and just my favorite teacher and it was the math teacher in high school and they, and I just love those stories. I can't get enough of them. And so, people who are wise, skillful, happy, joyful, patient, forgiving, generous, pay attention. Don't spend so much time on the people who aren't, the people who just, for whatever reasons, are something. Words escape me. Don't spend so much attention over there. Really, bring attention to the Father Greg Boyles and the Nelson Mandelas. I was watching the night before we came here. They had the evening news had, the whole thing was on the Pope in New York, and I was crying, just so delighted in him and in the fact that there were so many people who were so delighted, that it was so nourishing for people that this man was there. So let yourself be inspired. Who are your heroes? Who inspires you? Who gives you courage? It happens every day, every moment. Who are they? Remember them. Take them into your heart, your mind. The fourth one, I think, I've sort of lost count, but the next one, is the practice of gratitude. Can we be grateful? Can we be grateful? And I have another story. This is also, I get a lot out of the Washington Post. This was in the Washington Post. Those of you from IMCC have heard this before, because I gave a talk on it. It's a story about Steve Watkins. Steve Watkins. Steve Watkins is an ordinary guy who grew up in Topeka, Kansas, dreaming of adventures. He went to West Point, he graduated, he served in Afghanistan with the Army, and then spent a dozen or so years bouncing around war zones as a civilian contractor. The danger was intoxicating, but the memories of death and destruction stuck with him too, and Watkins says that he was diagnosed with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, in 2005. He eventually moved to Alaska, and the previous month had completed the 1,000-mile-long Iditarod dog sled race. And he decided to climb Mount Everest. He thought that would be a good next thing. And he was there in the base camp when the Nepal earthquake struck. And this is him. This is the story of his experience when the earthquake struck. A little bit of it. You can actually look it up, and it's still archived. You can find it. Lovely story. The earth shook as Steve Watkins sat in his tent on Mount Everest, more than 2,000 feet above the base camp. He and other members of a team with New Zealand-based adventure consultants had spent the night at the mountain's Camp 1. Watkins, 38, could barely stand as the ground jumped. Then his Sherpa, whose name I can't pronounce, standing next to him, spotted a wall of snow and ice, an avalanche, barreling their way. This was a minor avalanche of the support that Nepali guides often saw. But to Watkins, it looked like something out of a Hollywood movie. He'd never seen anything like that before. He ran to his tent, convinced he was in his final moments, muttering what he feared were his final thoughts to any higher power that was with him high on the mountain. You can, contemplate what your final thoughts might be in such a circumstance. These are Steve Watkins' final thoughts. So it ends now. Thank you for my life. I don't know what I did to deserve such a wonderful life, but thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Don't you know that that was not the first time in his life that Steve Watkins had practiced gratitude? That's what came up for him right then, in that moment. So it ends now. Thank you for my life. I don't know what I did to deserve such a wonderful life, but thank you, thank you, thank you. Gratitude. This is Clarissa Estes again. She says, in any dark time, there is a tendency to veer toward fainting over how much is wrong or unmended in the world. Do not focus on that. There is a tendency, too, to fall into being weakened by perseverating on what is outside your reach, by what cannot yet be. Do not focus there. That is spending the wind without raising the sails. We are needed, that is all we can know, and though we meet resistance, we more so will meet great souls who will hail us, love us, and guide us, and we will know them when they appear, and we can be grateful. Thank you. Thank you. Another one. Kindness to ourselves and others. We've worked with that so much this week, haven't we? Kindness. Anne Lamott, the novelist Anne Lamott, says, enlightenment is not a sudden event, but rather a daily struggle to be kind. I love that. Enlightenment is not a sudden event, but rather a daily struggle to be kind. This is Pema Chodron. She says, it isn't that we say it doesn't matter about me all that much, but if I change the world, it would be better for other people. It's less complicated than that. We don't set out to save the world. We set out to wonder how other people are doing and to reflect on how our own actions affect other people's lives. Enlightenment is not a sudden event, but rather a daily struggle to be kind. The next one, whose number I have lost. Knowing our own place in the family of things. That's a line from Mary's poem, Mary Oliver's poem. Knowing our own place in the family of things. What is mine to do? I know some of you from the interviews, some of you are struggling with that. You know, what is mine to do? I have 3 things that I would suggest about that. 1, think small. Some of you have heard my talk about the butterfly effect. In 1961, a man named Lawrence, I forgot his first name, was using, he was a weather scientist, and he was using a computer model, a numerical computer model, to rerun a weather prediction. You know how they plug all the data in to the weather model. They're doing that tonight, I'm sure. And he was using his computer to plug it in, and he was in a hurry. So the actual number of the sequence that he was supposed to plug in was, for some piece of data, I don't know what it was 0.506127. That was the actual number. But he was in a hurry, so he plugged in 0.506. So he left out, 0.000127. He left out that much data, okay? And then he ran the program, and the result was a completely different scenario, completely different weather pattern that's been replicated many times. That tiny little bit of difference interacted with all those other pieces of data, all those other causes and conditions, to manifest in a completely different weather pattern. And as he shared that with other scientists, they started calling it, the seagull effect, because a seagull could flap their wings, and then they decided to call it the butterfly effect. That was a little more poetic. That's the source of that. You've heard the story, a butterfly in the Amazon can flap its wings, but that's the source of that, that it's a real phenomenon. 0.000127 more of kindness on in any given moment can produce a totally different outcome. Think small. What is mine to do? 1, think small. 2, think manageable. What can I do with an open heart? Actually, that's number 3. Think manageable is number 2. Here's a quote from Thomas Merton. There is a pervasive form of contemporary violence, and that is activism and overwork. The rush and pressure of modern life are a form, perhaps the most common form, of its innate violence. To allow oneself to be carried away by a multitude of conflicting concerns, to surrender to too many demands, to commit oneself to too many projects, to want to help everyone or everything, is to succumb to the violence of our times. The frenzy of our activism neutralizes our work for peace. It destroys our own inner capacity for peace. It destroys the fruitfulness of our own work because it kills the root of inner wisdom, which makes work fruitful. Think manageable. And part of manageable is really look to see, what can I do today, now, in my life, what can I do with an open heart? What can I do with an open heart? Don't look to see, how many whales there are that are needed, that are needing help. Look to see. Start. David White has a poem that start close in. Start close in. What can I do with an open heart? Whatever it is that you can do with an open heart. And if your heart begins to close, you need to look not outside at the cause of it. It's not coming from outside. It's not coming from outside. Because look at all the ways that we could possibly close our hearts. Right now, all the stuff in the world. It's not coming from outside. How is it that you are allowing circumstances to pull you out of balance, out of tune, and what is needed to come back, to tune the lute? Don't try to play the lute if it's out of tune. This applies no matter how many people are suffering, no matter how many people are saving how many other whales. And no matter how many other whales there are to be saved. Help without wisdom and love is no help at all in this hurting world. Another one, humility and patience. Hugh talked about patience. I think Pat mentioned it as well. Many of you, I've told this story so many times. You've probably heard it 12 times from me, but I love it. The story about the Dalai Lama. Some of you haven't heard it, so I'll tell it again. The Dalai Lama was at a big Buddhist teachers gathering at Spirit Rock Meditation Center with all the Buddhist teachers in the world, and he wanted to meet with the kitchen staff. He just so sweetly, wanted to thank them for their support. And so he let them ask him questions, and one of the cooks said, I've been practicing for quite some time now, and I really get discouraged. I feel like it's not working. I don't feel like I'm making much progress. And the Dalai Lama paused and he said, I know what you mean. I feel that way too sometimes. Now you understand this man practices 5 hours a day, and he has done that his whole entire life, at least that much. He says, I know what you mean. I feel that way too. But then I look back 10 years over my life. I look back and I see actually that things are a little better. And so I take heart in that. It said that Pablo Casals, the great cellist, Pablo Casals, the great cellist, used to still practice, or still at 90. And people would say, why do you still practice? And he said, I'm beginning to notice some improvement. Humility and patience. Get over it. Forgiveness is another one. This is Mother Teresa. People are often unreasonable and self-centered, including ourselves. Forgive them anyway. If you are kind, people may accuse you of ulterior motives. Be kind anyway. If you are honest, people may cheat you. Be honest anyway. If you find happiness, people may be jealous. Be happy anyway. The good you do today may be forgotten tomorrow. Do good anyway. Give the world the best you have, and it may never be enough. Give your best anyway. For you see, in the end, it is between you and God. It was never between you and them anyway. We imagine that the spiritual life is pretty, that we hear a lovely teaching and we go home and we practice it serenely. We imagine that the Buddha's life, once he was enlightened, was, lotus flowers and angels and people just, fawning over him and telling him how wonderful he was and bringing him tea. This is Diane Musho Hamilton, who's a Zen teacher, Zen priest. She's talking about conflict. She says, learning how to negotiate conflict demands that we become more present, more fearless. Consequently, we may need to relinquish the hopeful image of ourselves as remaining serene under all circumstances, like sitting Buddhas carved from stone or wood. We have to expect our composure to be compromised as we learn about the possibilities and creative solutions of working directly with the conflict in our relationships. Even and maybe especially when things don't turn out as we want, our engagement with discord refines and teaches us, sometimes altering our life's very course. So we release and give away whatever we're holding on to that blocks our peace. Our patterns, our disguises, our complaints, the stories we tell about ourselves and our others. And we let ourselves open and allow ourselves to be touched. We allow an experience of coming into this moment, this one right now, and receive it, respond to it in all its goodness, its challenges, with flexibility and warmth. We learn to know and experience what truly heals, presence and inquiry, gratitude and tenderness, wisdom, diligence, joy, energy. This is Clarissa Estes again. She says, one of the most calming and powerful actions you can do to intervene in a stormy world is to stand up and show your soul. Soul on deck shines like gold in dark times. The light of the soul throws sparks, can send up signal flares, builds signal fires, causes proper matters to catch fire. To display the lantern of soul in shadowy times like these, to be fierce and to show mercy toward others, both are acts of immense bravery and greatest necessity. Struggling souls catch light from other souls who are fully lit and willing to show it. If you would help to calm the tumult, this is one of the strongest things you can do. This is the Dalai Lama again. He says, this is no easy task, and you must understand that there is no blessing or initiation, which if only we could receive it, or any mysterious or magical formula or mantra or ritual, if only we could discover it, that can enable us to achieve transformation instantly. It comes little by little, just as a building is constructed brick by brick, or an ocean is formed drop by drop. Nor that what we are talking about here is the mere acquisition of knowledge. It is not even a question of developing the conviction that may come from such a knowledge. What we are talking about is gaining an experience of virtue through constant practice and familiarization so that it becomes spontaneous. There are no shortcuts. We also have to know that if we wait to practice until the snakes are upon us, it will be very likely be too late to develop the kind of strength and resilience and wisdom and skill and clarity. We have to prepare our tents now for when the rains come. And I'd like to close by reading Olive Mary's poem, the poem Wild Geese, that I know many of you will know. She says, you do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over, announcing your place in the family of things. We are the ones we have been waiting for. Let's sit for a minute.